Now we just need to sand the panels. We can do the backs of them with the orbital sander. I don't want to take too much off around the edges with the higher grits because I want to keep that fit. It's a very light sand around the edges on the back. We don't need to sand anything off this fit edge on the front where it's parallel. We can sand the flat of the panel with the random orbit again, and then these beveled edges here are just going to have to be done by hand. So I'm going to make up a little 40mm wide hand sanding block and bevel the edge of it to suit the bevel that I've put on there and just run them in by hand. I'm just going to put part of the finish on these panels rather than glue them up or glue the door up with everything bare, because it's got quite a deep stain on there. It's a chestnut spirit stain, English walnut colour. If the panels were to move in them grooves and shrink slightly and you hadn't pre-stained the panels, you might see like a gap down the edge of that panel that's unstained and is a lighter colour, so it's not going to look great. So I'm going to pre-stain the panels and put a coat of hard wax oil on top of it, and that should help me with the glue up as well. I can clean off of that surface a bit easier than I could if it was just the dye on the bare wood. Got to be pretty quick with like a dye like this. You don't want to take your time too much, as you tend to get lines where the edge of the dye has stained one part and the other bit hasn't been stained. So get plenty on with a brush or a rag quite quickly. And don't leave a hard edge like that for too long to allow it to leave a line in it. Bear in mind it's quite runny and it runs round the corners, and we'll get onto the other face really quickly. Like here, if that was a seam section, you'd have a bit of a mark there, so got to work fairly fast here just to get that initial coverage on. Once you've got that, we can just slowly keep going over it, making sure it's absorbed well into all the grain. It sort of gives you where it's wet look there, it gives you a good idea of what the finish is going to look like as well. I'm not going to go for too high a gloss or polish finish on this door because the one it's sat next to is quite old and rustic, so we'll probably put some hard wax oil on it, matte it back with some sandpaper or wire wool or something, and then just put like a matte wax or something on it and not polish it up too highly. It might want a bit of aging too to the door. I've sort of rounded these, I've not kept these bevels dead sharp, I've rounded them off a little bit just to give it a bit more of a hand finished look rather than being dead sharp and crisp. Not quite the look that we've gone for. Same with this bevel on the panel here. I've just sort of took that off a bit by hand just to give it a bit of that beveled look that we're after, so it doesn't look too sort of brand new and sharp. Like I say, we might end up just chiseling a few bits back and knocking it and a few dents in it to age it a bit, but I think we can do that once it's been fitted. If it doesn't look good as quite a fresh item, that's always an option. I think we're best off fitting it while it looks good and seeing what we think from then on. Just bear in mind, if you're getting stain on the bearers and then you put a fresh panel on there, it's going to stain in them two sharp lines where the bearers are, so either keep changing them or turning them round to avoid putting a hard line of stain on the panel. We need to sand all the rails and mouldings too, so inside edges of the rails, which is this flat here. I know it's on the back of the door, but it wants sanding to get rid of them planer ripples, and then we want to sand this moulding off that we've machined in too. So this is the point at which you'll thank yourself having them really sharp cutters. Bearing in mind this has got to stay dead flat and straight anywhere there is a joint, using this edge as a shoulder, so this corner here has got to be real sharp. I'm just looking to get rid of any ripples from the moulder head so it looks sort of almost seamless. You've not got shiny sort of high spots that you catch when you're doing any buffing or anything. It's all just one sort of piece. It's nicely smoothed and sanded. Like I say, them sharp cutters will really help you out because it not only cuts it and doesn't rip the grain so much, it reduces the chatter which tends to cause any ripples in the moulding. So it's not taken much at all to get that nice and smooth, and that's a 240 grit sandpaper, so that's the sort of effort you want to be putting into sanding, not starting at 80 grit and working up to 240, you'll be there for days. Once the stain's dry, we can put the hard wax oil on. Obviously finish these panels in whatever you want, but I'm just going to seal them before we get it glued up. So we take our special application device, and add that hard wax oil on. You can put fairly liberal coating on for a start and let it absorb in, then buff it off a bit after about 2 or 3 minutes. Just take the excess off, and if you want a really, really fine finish that's going to fill the grains in and look like a highly sort of waxed French polish look, you just got to keep applying a little bit and then wiping it off after 5 minutes or so when it's soaked into them grains, and after about 20 coats you end up with a really nice finish. You've got to be a bit patient with it though. If you just want a good oil, like it's been oiled, that sort of look you get from the wood fresh after it's just had its first coat of oil, if you want that sort of look but with a bit of protection, then about 3 coats of hard wax oil applied like this is a pretty good way to go about it. So it's soaking in quite well there, so I'm just going to keep adding a bit more in. I mean, if your special application device has ventilation holes like this one does, then that's a bit of an added bonus, but they don't need to have that. If your colour's not quite right at this stage for what you wanted, you can do a test piece before you put any top coat on. You can always add a second dye colour to it to change the colour very slightly, or get a bit of a sealer on there, and then you can use a coloured wax, so either a lighter wax or a darker wax, and sort of merge that colour to where you want it to be. Pretty much there with this coat. So change your application device for a fresh one. We'll just take that excess off. It's just like a buffing. You don't want to leave any wet bits that it's going to dry glossy if you leave it in like a clump or in a corner where you can't quite reach with your cloth. It's going to dry glossy, so your best bet is to try and get all of them bits out. So really all you're doing is filling the grain in for a start. Beautiful. I'm doing the same thing with the moulding, so dye and then hard wax oil over the top. I'm just going to do the inside edges, so not going to do any of the face because that will need sanding after it's been glued up. And I'm just going to be really careful when I do glue up that I don't get too much glue on the moulding areas. And I'm also going to do this flat on the back of the door and seal that too. It's not going to matter too much if it spreads over on the face because it will sand out and then get re-dyed later on. I'm just going to put the top coat on over the dye. Be careful not to get it anywhere there isn't any dye so that it doesn't soak into the wood and prevent the dye from colouring the wood the same as what's already been coloured. This is just a bit of a precaution. If any glue squeezes out the joint, it's not going to soak into the wood and affect how the dye stains. Only really the important area are around the joints on this point here, so the rest of it could be left if you wanted and had the top coat put on afterwards, but while we're here we'll just run a first coat on and we can give it a light sand before it goes together so that it's nice and smooth and we've not got to do any delicate sanding on them internal corners around mouldings because it's quite hard work and you never get the finish that you want. There's a nice bit of grain on that one. So gnarly. I had to mitre that joint instead of scribe it because the grain is pretty much coming straight through the piece of wood. It's not a very strong joint, but it is only a muntin, it's not a rail. But I couldn't get a scribe on it because the grain was such an angle. The lightest touch with the sharpest chisel was just breaking the grain off of the end of the piece of wood, so I had to give in and mitre that one. But we've got a nice bit of figuring on it, which is key. Right, so it's time to glue this bad boy together. If you're using PU glue like I am, make sure absolutely everything is ready to go. You don't want to be forgetting wedges, got to get your hammer or your clamps out. Everything needs to be good to go because you haven't got a lot of time. I just use a stick like this in the actual mortises and take the corners off. So when you've squirted the PU glue in there, as you run that along the joint or along the surfaces inside that joint, rather than it being square edged and it just scraping the glue off, it actually uses that bevel as a bit of a leverage to just work it to the sides of the joint, and it's a bit easier to get a good coating all around the inside of the joint where it's quite difficult to access with anything else, so it works quite well. I'm just going to get the airline and blow all the dust out the joints everywhere. I've sanded these edges down just very lightly with a 320 grit sponge pad, so we've got no roughness on any of these mouldings. You can get plenty of glue in the actual mortise because it's not going to affect the glue squeeze out. It's just if you get too much in there, it'll just push it out the back of the joint, and it's not going to affect their mouldings by getting loads of glue all over them. What we don't want to get too much glue on is this bit of moulding here. So again, in the actual mortise, it's fine. You don't need an awful lot with PU glue anyway. Just be careful along these shoulders. But don't hang around, like I said, you've got to really go for this, especially if you've got a 5-minute set in PU. This one takes about, you've got about 10 minutes working time. Push it to about 15, but it starts getting very hard to do anything with it after that. Another option, a good option for oak is Cascamite. It would work well in this situation. I've not actually got any in the workshop at the minute, so it didn't really work well for me. I've got some Type 1 too. I'd have used that if I wasn't confident that I could get this glued up in the time needed. Type 1 2 is pretty good aliphatic resin, and it's just like a cold water cleanup. So Cascamite is hot water cleanup if you've ever used it. You want just a tub of warm water, cleans up really nicely, whereas aliphatic resin or Type Bond seems to clean up a lot better with cold water. When I first started or made the switch from Cascamite to Type Bond, I really struggled to clean the glue off. I thought it was a bit inconsistent. Sometimes it would clean off and sometimes it wouldn't, but you have to have cold water, it seems to clean off a lot better. So I'm not going to put hardly anything in that scribe. It's going to get a bit scraped off the tenon here and run into the scribe, and that'll be enough. I don't want to. It's not really going to add any strength to the joint gluing that scribe section. All it's going to do is produce a load of glue squeeze out. So the back edge isn't too bad because it's square. We can clean that a little bit easier. A little stick in the mortise. After you've done a couple of joints, the stick gets nicely coated up and works really well. Right, so that's bottom. So he goes in there. Next one. Don't forget to glue your panels in either. I've seen that happen before. You get carried away gluing up, wedge it together, and just as you drive that last wedge home, you think, oh, I forgot to put the panels in. Especially if you've not been working on them. You know, if you did the panels a bit earlier in the job and then you've been sanding and stuff and put them to one side. You're so used to gluing up doors that are just glazed and not got panels in or whatever. It's dead easy to miss them or forget about them and get a bit carried away. It's all about getting carried away, and you've glued your door up without the panels in it. And there isn't really a lot you can do from that point on, other than cut the grooves out and bead it. That's not a very good job, is it? No. Right, push him right in and get that appropriate panel. You don't want any glue on the panel. Panels need to be able to freely move within the door. So if you glue your panels in rock hard, you're asking for trouble with the door bit twisting or warping because no movement in any of the joints across the solid door. It's quite a wide area. So you've got like an 800mm wide door that can't accommodate any movement in any of it. So it's either going to split the panels or start bending your door. If you've got really strong panels and strong glue, you'll see movement in the door. So the best way to overcome it is to allow them panels to actually freely move within the grooves, and that's why you allow a little bit of room when you actually make them so that they can move. Best way to clean the PU glue off. There's a certain stage when it's drying where it's still sticky. You probably have seen if you watch the window video that I've done. I've mentioned it in that, but there's a certain stage where it's still sticky but it's set, so if you touch it, it doesn't stick to you, but it's still just a tiny bit soft. So at that point where it doesn't actually stick to your fingers if you touch the bead of glue that's squeezed out, is the point at which you want to be cleaning it off, because it tends to clean off really easily but doesn't stick to everything. So it's just a case of tooling the bead of glue off then. Phone's going off, we're in trouble. Oh, we're really in trouble. Make sure everything's coated. I know we're in a bit of a rush, but the strength of the joint relies on everything having been covered in glue. Remember that the end grain does soak the glue up as well, so PU is quite good because it does foam up a bit, so there's always glue on the surface, even if it's soaked a load of it up. There's always glue there to actually make a bond. Sometimes you can see Cascamite, etc. will coat the end grain up, and then when you come to put it together, there's no glue on the joint, on the end grain because it's soaked it all up. So you have to reapply the glue, and you'll see that again when the door's dry. It could have soaked up all again, and the joint's not actually very strong at that end grain shoulder because it's physically just soaked all the glue away up into it. So I do like PU glue for that fact. I actually tried to disassemble a PU glued door that someone else had made. It was Kerowin actually, which is unusual, but just Kerowin boards glued like a legend braced door. Not very joinery construction, it was just boards screwed together, 90 degrees with PU glue on the joints, you know, between the two boards. They were so stuck it just wrecked the boards trying to get it apart, and that door must have been 10 years old. So for me that was a good sort of point at which I realised that PU glue is sort of maybe worth looking at to use in your joinery rather than just dismissing it because it's hard to work with. So since that point I've used it more and more. I now favour it over most of the other glues. Plus the fact it's dead quick to go off, so you can crack on. You know, once this is wedged up, you can just carry on with the build rather than wait until the next day for Cascamite to go on. Just want to keep the clamps as parallel as possible across the door. That might mean moving them a bit as the door goes together. Just clamp it even if you want it as square as possible. Once them joints are up, just nip them all up tight, back them off a bit, then stick a clamp on along the length and make sure them joints are nice and tight. I usually go do the centre for a start, make sure that's up, and then just nip either edge until they're nice and tight to them stop lines in the mortises, and then the wedges should do the rest. When this is clamped up, so these joints are clamped, the wedges aren't really going to be able to move that joint, so you want it to be where it's going to be before you physically wedge it. Then just run a couple of clamps from the opposite side so that your door is clamped nice and flat across the stiles and it's not being pulled, so these clamps will bow that door in this direction. If you put one on the opposite side, it helps to counteract it. This is where it's nice to have a bit of a horn left on the top of the door here. You can actually set a clamp on it a bit further away so you've got access to wedge your joint without the clamp being in the way. Right, before I wedge it, because I'm using PU glue and it might have crept in the grooves a little bit, I'm just going to make sure all the panels are in the right place. And I've got time to wedge it after that. But moving them panels might be a bit more difficult the more the glue sets. So we want a hammer and a block of wood. And a little bit of a square edge on it. Just remove that clamp. Touch. Just making sure the corners are all nicely engaging into each respective corner in the moulding. And another reason why you don't want them panels to be too tight. If they've got to whack them into place, it's difficult when you're trying to glue the door up to physically get the door together. When you've got to this stage, you've got zero adjustment because the panels won't move because it's so tight. There you go, that's good. There's plenty of glue in the wedge holes anyway, but I'll just pop a little bit on each side of each wedge just to make doubly sure. You can find with PU glue, if your wedges aren't tight, it will push them back out and start bouncing. You've got so much glue in there, they don't go in. What's that? 2, 4, 2, 4. They're always in groups of 4. Always with Cascamite, you'd hold 4 wedges together and glue them up in a 4, sort of like this. So I was taught, done it for years, like that. Hold your 4 wedges, glue them up, and then you'll never have too many wedges unless you've got a rail or something with 2 wedges one side and 4 the other. But generally they're in sets of 4 because you'll have a 10 on each end of every rail. One more. Right, just the right amount of glue. Just clean that off a bit so you can see what's going on. So we wedge the 4 corners of this type of door first. We always do the outside wedge, the one nearest the outsides of the door. And we tap that one in until it sort of takes up the slack and that tenon is sitting nicely on that cut line that we've cut the mortise to. Once it's got to that position, we can tap the other one up to the same tightness and then tighten them both by hammering them home. Same on every corner. Tap it up so it's tight on the outside, bring the other one to meet it, so you're not going to snap that tenon. And then tighten them up. On these two rails, just do the outside ones again. Don't miss the wedge and take a massive chunk out the edge of the door. So we're quite tight on timings there. I mean, I've literally just finished wedging that up, and we're getting to the stage where it's perfect to clean that up without too much effort. I'll just show you what I mean. There's a little bit of squeeze out there, but it just wants to be soft. It's maybe not quite there yet. No, it's about there. But it should just clean up like that. But that should be just soft. So the inside of it might still be wet with PU glue on the very core, but the majority of it should be soft but not sticky. But you see there's tiny bits of glue squeeze out, but it should just almost come off with the chisel without really having to touch it at all. It's not going to stick to the woodwork, but it's not stuck to the joint. It's dead easy to remove it. Don't leave it to go rock hard, because it's a right git. You can't even get your chisel in. It seems to bounce your chisel away, even the most razor sharp chisel, because it's got a bevel on there and the cutting edge is forward of the bevel. The physical bevel of the chisel stops it from getting into the joint. Yeah, it's dead easy to clean off when it's nice and soft like this. You want a dead sharp chisel. I'm going to have to answer my phone in a minute, I'll be in real trouble. Once the wedges have been driven home, if you need to glue up more doors, you can take the clamps off and wedges will hold it as long as they're tight. And it's one of the advantages of wedging a joint like that, so you can remove the clamps straight away. That's it, ready to go. You can carry on with it now. It's pretty much gone off enough to work with it. I'll just clean the glue squeeze out from the backs of them tenon joints and trim any wedges off that might stick out still. Try not to mark the door edges too much with the saw in case your door's not got much room for fitting. You don't want big saw cut marks in it. Just planing enough off to get it flush. You don't want to take a divot out either. So working with the hinge side down to the bed of the saw, I'm going to cut the top off square and then cut the saw to length to suit the frame that it's going to fit in. I'm going to cut it quite tight in this frame, so we're going to have about a 1.5 mm gap either side of the door, both top and bottom and down the sides. I've laid the door flat on the bench. The easiest way to fit anything like this is to lay it flat down so there's no movement involved. If you're trying to fit something while it's vertically hung, you have to end up packing it to hold everything in place, so it's a bit more tricky. So it's dead easy to get stuff done on the bench, so use it. The height's perfect at that setting. I couldn't have got it better if I'd tried. Give it a bit of luck. Quite often you'll be 0.5 mm out. Cut it again. That looks bob on. We've got about 1.5 mm at the top and the same gap at the bottom, and it's nice and parallel across the door and the frame. I'm just going to take a trimming off the sides now, because there's about 1.5 mm gap over the whole door. So what I need is about another 1.5 mm off in the width, and it's quite parallel. It's really good. So I'll take a sliver off of this hinge edge first, parallel all the way along on the planer, and I'll do the same on the other side and work up to that gap that I want. Perfect. Just making sure the gaps top and bottom are correct before I tick the hinge locations over onto the frame from the door. I usually use a similar size or a smaller screw when I'm test fitting hinges, and don't put the finished screws in, like the final screws that are going to remain in the hinges, until you're absolutely happy with the fit and finish of the door and it's not going to be unscrewed again. Now I'm expecting this to catch because I've not took a leading edge off and potentially be. It's just missed, that's perfect. So I'm just going to pan around the gaps we've got. It's just over 1 millimetre here on the leading edge or the swinging side of the door. And then on the hinge side, we've got probably just over 1.5 millimetres. It's not quite 2 mil, but that's only got them 2 small screws in it. So by the time we've got all 6 screws in each hinge, I think we're going to tighten that gap up very slightly and we should end up with about the right gap. So I'm going to leave that until the frame is fitted, and then if we need to just pare a tiny sliver off the hinge housing to get it to fit right, that's better than going a bit too much. Well, we've got the door swinging on the hinges, pretty much the exact position it's going to go. I'm just going to mark where those magnets we set in earlier are on the frame, and then we can transfer that across to the door so that we can drill in the appropriate place on the door so that the magnet catch works. A couple of ways to do this, either measurement from the edge here or physically tick a mark over. I'm just going to set a bit of masking tape on here so I don't leave a mark on the timber. I'll just use a square on the back here and mark the centre of their magnets through. They're nice and strong, the squares stick into the wood well. Got them 2 points there. In order to get the offset in depth on the door to make the magnets work, they need to be about 4 mil offset so that they have a pull together even when they're onto the stop. You don't want to set them at the same depth from the face in the frame as you do on the door, because if you get it slightly wrong, it could actually work against you and hold the door away from the stop. So to accurately measure, if you've housed them in like I have from this back edge where you can't see where you've drilled, we can just use a physical magnet, find its home position and just draw around it. Sit him on there. You want a bit of masking tape for this job so that you don't end up marking the timber with the metal of the magnet or any oils that are on it. So that one's there, that one's there. So when that magnet's set in the door, it wants to be about 4 mil offset, so somewhere there in the flush position. So when them 2 pieces of timber are flush, so we've got that bit of pull on the magnet. Don't drop them because they smash. If I'm drilling these in, I just set up a marking gauge to the centre, then I'll mark that on something and just bring it back 4 mil. To make sure that we've got that offset. So that's the centre line for my drilling on that door. I'll just check it for both of them magnets. They're pretty well the same. Do the same for the bottom. and then we can drill them into the top and bottom of the door. Using the 2 marks of the magnet locations that I've got on the face now, I can just tick them over like so, and square those 2 lines over. We're marking from that same face that we gauged the magnets from. I just stab a centre point hole, like a centre point punch, then drill in on them points. Now I normally have a really nice bit that drills these, but I seem to have lost it, so I had to resort to the only other bit that I've got that will fit the pellets that I use, which is a nasty flat bit. But if you have a look through my previous videos, there is a tutorial on doing these magnet catches. It might be worth a watch if you've not come across them before. I've got some clear glue here, some super glue. I'm just going to coat the inside of that housing with it, make sure it's all covered. Then we go back to our setting piece here. So this was a frame magnet setting piece. All the frame magnets are the same as this. So the frame will sit in this like orientation, so we can just sit it in like that. And that's our magnet set, and we know we've got the right orientation. Tap him home. You can leave them magnets exposed like that. It looks quite nice just to have a silver magnet. It's very discreet. It's in the top and the bottom of the door, so you're never going to see it. But as this is quite a low door on the top here, I'm just going to put a little plug in over the top of the magnet, an oak plug, and very gently just tap that home. So it's about 2 mil deep. I've forgotten to turn the camera on while I was cutting these pellets off, but I've just used a really fine Japanese sort of flush saw, but kept it away from the edges so as not to damage them too much. And then I just run it down to final depth with either a really sharp plane or a belt sander. Bearing in mind you've only got like a 1 mil thick veneer of pellet glued into the actual pellet hole. There we go, we've got a lovely bit of pull on that magnet catch there. Probably won't be able to see it till it's been fitted, and it's got no tension in it from gravity, but it's a beautiful sort of, it's a gentle pull, but it's quite strong at seating the door, so they do work well. I just need to take the door off now and take a leading edge off the back of this swing inside, and then I can just get to work sanding and finishing the frame and the door.